supporting. I think we need to take a critical attitude to any movements that say, you know, women can be liberated under capitalism, because I think that's completely impossible. But also, I think we need to put forward like a positive examples, like glimmers of hope, which we could see from what the genital did, and also to educate men, to convince them to take a leading role in fighting for women's rights.
Het is maandag 29 oktober en dit is Linkse Hobby's, de podcast van Authentiek Links. Vandaag hebben we ons interview met Anne McShane, een Ierse kameraad van de Communist Party of Great Britain. Zij heeft het over haar studies naar de vrouwenbeweging in de vroege jaren van de Sovjet-Unie en de vrouwenbeweging vandaag de dag in Ierland. Over het eerste onderwerp hield ze op de Communist University een sessie die we wederom op onze website hebben gezet en die is zeker het kijken waard. Aan de hand hiervan sprak ik met haar over de strijd van de vrouwenemancipatie vroeger en vandaag de dag. Veel luisterplezier. Today I'm interviewing Anne McShane. She has a long history of involvement in the workers' movement, both in Britain and in Ireland. She stood in a number of elections in Britain for the CPGB, the Communist Party of Great Britain, and the Socialist Alliance. Today she's active in Cork, where she continues to struggle for a united revolutionary party in Ireland. And I've got some questions that I'm going to ask her today. First up, you've been a member of the CPGB for a long time now. How did you become politically active, and why exactly did you become active for the CPGB?
Okay, so I came to Britain when I was 25, and before I had come here, I was like quite aware of politics, particularly politics in Ireland, the republicanism and the struggle for United Ireland, and also on questions to do with women. Because when I came to London in 1986, a long time ago now, it was really quite a bad time in Ireland. Women were very repressed. They had no rights. There were a lot of scandals about women. Obviously, it's only now that Ireland just had a referendum for abortion rights for women. But at that time, the 1980s was a really, really, really bleak time, really dark time. So when I came to England, I came here to work as a social worker, and I looked around for things to get involved in, and basically I started like Amnesty International and whoever I met on the picket line or whatever I was always talking to. And then I just met this guy I was working with who was a trade union rep, and I started to come to meetings. And then in 1990, they asked me to stand in the general election as part of 4 candidates that we stood, and that was to do with reclaiming the banner of the Communist Party of Great Britain, because the old leadership of the party had changed their name and liquidated the party and said communism is no longer relevant. So that's kind of how I went from being interested to really properly involved in about 1990. So yeah.
Well, thank you. That's really interesting. And you did a PhD, and you did your PhD on the history of the Women's Bureau of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, which is of course very political and with the women's question. Could you maybe tell something more about that?
Okay, so just firstly again, the background to my deciding to do that was, so when I've been going to left-wing meetings for decades, and I always wondered what had happened with the women in the Soviet Union, and I was never able to find out, and invariably male comrades would say to me, well, they achieved legal equality but no real equality because the circumstances didn't allow for it. And so I didn't really quite accept that. And then when I moved back to Ireland, basically I was working in a job and I just got a little bit of time, and a comrade here, Yasmina Mather, helped me to get on the PhD course. So what I've been studying is about the role of the Women's Bureau of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which was known as the Zhenotdel, and how it came about, and what it did in the Soviet Union, because it only lasted for 10 years. Stalin closed it down in 1930. It was set up in 1919 and closed down in 1930. What its ideas were, what it aimed to do, and what its relationship with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was. So I've just recently submitted, and I'm extremely happy that I've managed to do this work, because it's opened up a whole history to me that I wasn't properly aware of before. And I really just hope that I can bring this history into the discussions within the left on contemporary questions, and also in order to inform properly our debates about the Russian Revolution, because really women have been missing for most of the debates. So,
because a lot of time you hear like, oh no, but it was the women kind of that started the first revolution in the beginning of the 20th century in Russia, or that they were like super equal because they were living under communism. But apparently it's way more nuanced, what you're telling me.
Yeah. So in February 1917, there were strikes and demonstrations that were begun in Petrograd, which was like St. Petersburg and then Leningrad and then St. Petersburg, but it was that city that was called Petrograd for a little while during the First World War. So these demonstrations broke out, but even before that, there had been women, leading women, who had been active in writing and campaigning around the woman question in Russian politics. Some that were supported by Lenin, and some that were outside of that. Anyway, so these demonstrations happened, and the situation changed quite radically, but the idea is often put that this was just like a spontaneous movement, so that the women were the kind of lit the torch, and then the men kind of basically came on and sorted it all out properly afterwards with the October Revolution. But actually that's not exactly true. Although women weren't in very leading positions generally within the party, women played an extremely important role in terms of building the movement, and women like Alexandra Kollontai, Ines Armand, and women like that also were very strong, had very strong roles within the party. Alexandra Kollontai, after October 1917, became the first woman minister of any government in the world. She became Commissar for Welfare. And then, anyway, after the revolution, basically many of these women activists within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union found that the women, basically there was nothing really being done to address the needs of the women, working class women who had voted for and supported the Bolsheviks in the Soviets, and they set about trying to address this. So they had a conference in 1918, and following that they set up an organisation which then became the Zhenotdel, and that basically gave itself the task of being the voice for women's rights within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and seeking to develop as much as possible the programme of the party. And essentially what they focused on was trying to collectivise and so like socialisation of like tasks like childcare, laundry, so allowing women to have make arrangements for the children to be looked after collectively, so they could go on training courses, so that they could go to work, so that basically they were relieved of the burden of domestic labour, and that could get fully involved in society. So that was their aim, to try and make very big changes to the way women lived.
And what is your view on this question now? The whole idea of the women being well or not emancipated, and their role in domestic labor in society. Do you think that we have still have a world to win? And do you think we, as communists, need to do something different in our movements?
Okay, so basically, the Genotel had a really hard time trying to survive within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and to make progress. And obviously, you know, it's argued that a lot of that was to do with the terrible conditions of the time and that they couldn't make progress because of the fact that they were fighting the Civil War and then they were trying to survive in it, blah, blah, blah. But I think that one of the most important things was the lack of education of Communist Party men who generally didn't support women's rights and didn't really want things to fundamentally change. And so today what I think we need to do as communists is I think that we really need to start to properly educate ourselves on issues to do with women's rights. And I think that rather than, for instance, tailing movements like the Me Too movement or intersectionalism, either like just criticizing it, only criticizing it, or kind of saying, oh yes, that's, you know, or else just simply supporting it. I think we need to take a critical attitude to any movements that say, you know, women can be liberated under capitalism, because I think that's completely impossible. But also I think we need to put forward like a positive examples, like glimmers of hope, which we could see from what the Genotel did, and also to educate men, to convince them to take a leading role in fighting for women's rights. And also I think within our left-wing parties, we really need to start to try to recruit women and start to try to promote women into positions within the party. And oftentimes women won't be very they'll be nervous about that, because even though, look, you know, yes, it's 100 years after the Russian Revolution, but women are still oppressed in today's society, and women are often very nervous about putting themselves forward. So I think we have a role to try and educate women and give them confidence and show them that we want to create, that we're fighting for kind of socialism which is inclusive and within which they have a vested interest in fighting for. So I think there's a lot to be done there, and I think that there's like a lot of cultural changes that need to be made. So yeah, that's that would be my view about the things that we need to do now. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have any like concrete advice or a tip for the movement now to make our movement more inclusive for women? Like a small...
Yeah, well, I think that we should start to have more meetings on issues to do with women's rights, not just in Britain or in the Netherlands, but like issues affecting women internationally. Like I think, you know, on the Me Too movement, on the situation with Trump and women, on the question of abortion rights internationally, like so many of these questions, I think that we should start to have meetings. And I think that lots of women will want to come along to these meetings. And then I also think that we should start to look at writers who aren't communists, but women writers who've written about women's issues. Oftentimes, communist political groups either kind of ignore them or just criticize them because they're not communist. But very many times these women writers have important things to say that we can learn from without becoming feminists ourselves. So I just think we need to involve ourselves more in it and become more visible and more openly pro-women's rights. Thank you.
I completely agree. I do have a question still, because of you already mentioned the abortion laws.
Yeah.
Since you're from Ireland,
yeah.
and the referendum about the law around abortion is of course still super relevant. Can you tell something about how you were feeling about that referendum, or what you did for it, or anything at all about that?
So, as I said to you earlier, like I left Ireland in the 1980s during this really bad time for women, when, you know, one particular young woman died at a religious grotto in Ireland, a woman called Anne McShane, who had died in, you know, having her baby on her own on a dark, rainy night, who had nobody to turn to because there was so much shame associated with being pregnant and not being married. So that, like lots of women like me, felt very strongly when it came to this referendum. We've been fighting for years to try and make progress, and then we've started to have some success with demonstrations over the last few years. And actually what was really positive for us was to see whenever it came to opinion polls that there was such a high percentage in favour of abortion rights, because in reality in Ireland women do have abortions, they just do it illegally. They either travel abroad to Britain or they import pills illegally. So it's just like, and then what happens is that the government took it up, which was very shocking really. I mean, they tried to initially they tried to sideline it, and then eventually they took it up, and this existing Taoiseach Irish Prime Minister tried to make the question his own. But even though you could say, oh, that's just a mainstream question, I think it was more because of the pressure that he was put under rather than it being his idea. And there was a very big fight with the church, and we were like besieged with postings from the United States, pro-lifers, and like they came with big posters of abortions, alleged abortions, and stood outside hospitals. And anyway, so like it was just so brilliant that we actually got such a resounding vote for women's rights. So like we got, I think, like 66% in favour of women's rights abortion, which isn't, it's only, you don't have to give any reason up to 12 weeks. And then after 12 weeks, it has to be for a threat to risk to life or risk to health, serious risk to health or life for a woman or the embryo. But that's just a hugely different scenario. So it was absolutely fantastic. It just felt like, wow, we really have come into a new, just a new phase. You know what I mean? Just a more like that the church just doesn't have the hold on people that it used to have. And that what I found really brilliant was that so many men supported it. And this was like old men that you would think would never support it, who were saying basically it's none of our business. And then younger men in their 30s who said, I'm voting yes because I don't want my wife, my partner or our daughters having to be in a situation of having their autonomy to decide on their, whether they're pregnant or not, to be like in such a vulnerable position. And just finally on it, the thing about it was that what sort of really became clear was it wasn't just so basically the position in the Constitution, which has now been changed with the right to life of the unborn will be removed from the Constitution. So that having it in there, like, left many women when they were in a crisis pregnancy, for instance, if they were pregnant and they had started to miscarry, where they should have terminated the pregnancy because it was going to terminate anyway naturally. They would be left there until the heartbeat stopped. So this woman called Savita Halappanavar, an Indian woman, she's a dentist living in Galway. She and her husband, that happened to them. And so basically she was in the hospital begging for an abortion, and they said, we can't, under the law, we can't give you an abortion. So she died of sepsis because, she got such a serious infection. And then afterwards, like, it just became apparent that this wasn't a unique thing. Obviously her death was like relatively unusual, but that's what happens with women. If you start to miscarry, if you're bound to miscarry, they send you home. They say you just have to wait for the heartbeat to stop. I mean, it's just treating women like baby machines, and you've got absolutely no rights to make decisions, and depriving women when they become pregnant of any of the same sort of human rights. So there were so many arguments around it, and I think that many of those arguments will go on now. And I mean, I certainly hope that they do. I mean, the legislation hasn't changed yet, but it will hopefully in September. So I just think it was just a fantastic step forward for Irish women. But we can't be complacent because, in the world today, obviously we really are. What happened in Ireland was quite unique in comparison to what's happening in the United States and other countries. So we've got to continue to fight for that and try to give inspiration to women in other countries like Poland and elsewhere who are, still facing extremely repressive laws.
Well, thank you so much.
No bother. Thank you so much for asking to speak. Okay.